All right, welcome back. For this week's lecture, we will be continuing our lessons over exposure and all of the different aspects and how we can control them in order to become better photographers while using the manual mode. As a review, the word exposure refers to the amount and act of light falling on photosensitive material, whether that be digital, card, or film. Previously using film cameras as the method of storing the information, storing the photos on, and prior to that was the chemicals and metals that were used in order to capture the images. We are now using SD cards, C-Flash, and C-Flash Express cards in order to capture images. As an introduction, of course, control is important for photographers, whether you're beginning or whether you're an advanced photographer, because controlling the amount of light that enters the camera is the very essence of photography. As we've already gone over, storytelling. Storytelling is a huge part in your ability to become a better photographer because no matter what medium you're using as a creative visual artist, you are going to need to tell stories. You are going to need to communicate. With photography, the way that you communicate is through light, through photos. And in order to even have these photos, you need to be able to take in that information, that light, into your camera and to come out with the desirable photo that you're trying to have an outcome with. And the way that you can control the three aspects used in exposure, your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, is what we'll be going over in these next couple of lessons. So of course, our first aspect going to be in this lesson is going to be aperture. So aperture, the easiest way to understand it, as we've gone over already, is it is depth of field. It is how many objects in our field of vision that we are going to narrow our lens's ability to capture. In this picture here, you can see on the bottom are a couple of numbers with an F. That F stands for an f-stop, and the different circles above them is a representation of the opening of your lens. As you can see at a 1.4, that should be a 1.4, not 1 comma 4. At 1.4, your lens is going to be wide open. Now, even though it is wide open, you are going to have a very narrow field of vision, as you can see in the representation above it. In that picture above it, you're going to be isolating the subject with the background having a nice bokeh, having a nice blurry, it's very smooth, very clean. As you go up this chart, which you will need to memorize, you go up from f-stop 2, f-stop 2.8, you can see how the background starts to slowly just come back into view, eventually coming into f-stop 32, which is ideal for landscape photography. With landscape photography, you of course are going to need a tripod, but that is a whole nother matter. Just remember that your depth of field, your aperture, controls how much of your scene you are allowing to be in your scene. Here is an example that we have already gone over. With this example, of course, you are going to be using a lower f-stop. As you can see here, we're going to use the f-stop 2 as an example, where obviously we are going to be trying to center on the ladybug itself rather than the flower, the leaf, anything that is in the background. Now it is a little bit, we are still able to discern somewhat of the background, so I would not say that the depth of field is extremely low, but it's still low enough that we still have that smooth background. You have a nice contrast between a very sharp subject and that background which is blurred out, which is a great technique for portraits or even just macro photography. Here's another example we have seen as well, where you have everything in your depth of field very clear, and then here the one in the middle getting isolated. And as you can see, again, once that depth of field has been isolated, once you have isolated that subject, you can see on the lens in the middle that there are certain details that you weren't able to see in this previous image. Now you are able to make it out a little bit, but narrowing that depth of field, narrowing the detail, the amount of information that needs to be taken in, allows you to center on a lot of the details that are a lot smaller, a lot more, you need a lot more focus in order to take those in. That's why you're able to see a lot of the dust specks on that lens in the middle. And here's another example where the depth of field is narrowed, where it's just isolated on the keyboard and on the monitor in the forefront, and this second image being a very wide depth of field, a little bit wider depth of field where you're able to see most of the scene. This will come into play later as we talk about the different technical aspects of Aperture. These are the blades that are included, that are inside as far as the mechanics of your lens. Your aperture is going to be controlled mechanically by your lens itself, but your camera is what's going to control as far as the technical aspect. So on your camera, you're going to be able to rotate a knob in order to control your aperture, but it's the lens itself that determines what is the highest, what is the lowest that your aperture can go to. Here's another example of those aperture openings that would be going on inside of your lens. 1.8, of course, being very wide, 2.8, 4.8, and 8.0 f-stop getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Here is that picture again of the different examples of how the f-stops come into play when it comes to how much of a scene you're going to allow into your photo. Here's a great example of a wide depth of field being used for a photo, f-stop 32 being used on these flowers. Of course, you are still going to have a little bit of blur in the background, especially if you're going to be have great focus points. You are going to have a little bit of a blur because your focus is solely on what is in the forefront. But as you can see in f-stop 5, the flowers are very much in focus. There's a little bit of a blur around some of the flowers that are on the edges of the middle of the photo, but everything else in the background has that nice blurry background. Here's another example of that once again. F-stop 5.8, giving you a good rounded aperture as far as your depth of field. You're able to see great detail in that leaf and some areas surrounding it, but still that background having that nice blur. Your focus points are great. F-stop 2.8, you're going to see a little bit of a blur start to affect the subject, so you want to be very precise with what your focus points are, as well as with what your subject is. As you can see in f-stop 1.8, your control over your aperture goes out the window a little bit as you're narrowing your depth of field a little bit more, so it's a little bit harder to see what it is that you intended to have in focus. So it is important when you're getting to those lower f-stops that you make sure that your focus points are on point and you're getting those correct. We're going to see some more examples of differences between apertures. Here is going to be a wide aperture. You're going to see that it's very much focused on just those books. And then here you've got a very, I apologize. Whenever we say this is something, as far as aperture, it's something that I've seen a lot of students struggle with as far as the terminology, and it can get confusing saying wide, saying closed, because they often mean the opposite. So I will go by the numbers as far as this is going to be a lower f-stop. Stop down, it's going to be around 2.8 to 4. That's why it's very centralized, blurry with the surroundings. And then this one is going to be a higher number on that f-stop scale. That's why it's able to take in more information. Here's a great example as well where your f-stop is going to be a lot more narrowed as far as I apologize. It's going to be wide open as far as how many details you're going to be taking in. You can see that the whole scene is very much taken in. You're able to see buttons, you're able to see knobs, and it goes pretty far back into the corner of the back of the corner of this console. You're able to see detail very easily, and then this, of course, being that extreme example where your f-stop is lowered to 2.8, maybe even lower. This is a great example of that bokeh that I was mentioning, where you have that nice smooth background in your photo where it's blurred. And one great thing that you can do creatively is with that bokeh, something that's going to be amplified is the lights in the background. So if you're doing photos on maybe like a city walk or maybe some neon signs in the background and you're trying to implement bokeh, that's a very creative decision, and it turns out really well. So I advise that if that's something that you're interested in, that's something that you may want to try out, because that bokeh just amplifies how that light looks in the background, and it just looks so much better than this, of course, what we're seeing here. Here's another example, of course, of macro photography where the focus is going to be on the words specifically, not to the point where we can see exactly what is being written, but this is a great example of where we're able to put ourselves into the scene. It's great storytelling. We can see what's going on here, probably vows, probably working on some vows or something prior to the wedding, writing those out. Very intimate because of how close it is. We're filling the scenery with it. This is a great example of narrowing your depth of field so that all that we're focusing on is the letters in the that this subject is writing down. And here's a great example of where you have a little bit of a wider depth of field where you're taking in more objects, more we can call them subjects as far as the cacti and the shrubbery in the background. But that background is still having that nice blur to it. Not we're still able to discern things, so I wouldn't say that we have a very low f-stop number. So I would say we're at probably around 5 to 11 for this. Here are some examples of lenses as far as we're going to be talking about f-stop numbers and aperture numbers. One thing that you do want to consider and remember is that not all lenses are going to be, I'll use the phrase, not all lenses are created equally. Not all lenses are going to have the same capabilities. On this lens on your left, that is going to be what we're calling a kit lens. We will be going into lens classifications and the descriptions of all of them in the future, but just to give you a little bit of a head start into that knowledge, if you look on the lens on the left, it is of course an 18 to 55 millimeter lens from Nikon. You're going to also see on the badge on the bottom middle, you're going to see the brand, and you're also going to see several other indicators. You're going to see AFS, that's just the mounting system. And then a little bit to the right of 18 to 55 millimeters, you're also going to see something that says 1 and then colon 3.5 to 5.6. That is going to be what we call a variable aperture lens. Variable meaning that it can change, and your aperture has two basically limits beyond what it is able to go. 3.5 being the lowest and 5.6 being the highest. So it can go as wide as 3.5 with the aperture and as small as 5.6, which I know that sounds confusing, but it will make sense as you get used to it. On the right, you are going to have, aligning with that saying that I said earlier, not all lenses are created equally. The more expensive lenses are going to have more capabilities in that one big thing that they have as far as why you're paying more for them is their aperture range. This one in particular, if you read the badge in the same format, it's going to be AFS. You're going to see the 17 to 55 millimeter, and then it's going to say 1 colon 2.8. So this is what we're going to be calling what is called a prime lens, where it has a one specific aperture range that it works at. So with variable lenses, the problem is that they do have that ability to zoom in and zoom out, but the big thing is that zoom is going to determine how wide your aperture can go to. With this one on the right, it's more expensive. It doesn't matter if you're at 17 millimeters or 55 millimeters or anything in between. You're able to go as wide and as low in f-stop as 2.8. Of course, you can go higher in number and whatnot, but you cannot go lower than 2.8. But this is a great example of that difference between a prime lens and a variable aperture lens. Here is I would say the Canon version I wanted to give you. These are two models that are very expensive. It's top of the line models. On the left, you've got the 50 millimeter. There are much cheaper options that are around $100, which I would say is a better option for you to grab. The only difference is your aperture range is going to be, I believe, because I did purchase one of these a long time ago when I started. The 50 millimeter was either 1.8 or 2 f-stop as the maximum aperture, which we will go over later, meaning the widest that your aperture can go. So the one on the left, getting back to that, is the 50 millimeter f-stop 1.2, and it is an L series. That is the reason for that L, going for almost $1,500, and the one on the right going a little bit above $1,500. So you're going to be investing a lot of money into some good quality glass or lenses. The one on the right, Canon EF 24 to 70 millimeter f-stop 2.8 L. These are also two examples of prime lenses regarding their aperture, where the aperture is, with the one on the left being more of a prime lens because your prime focal length is going to be 50 millimeter, but it also is only going to be going down to 1.2. You cannot go any wider than that. The one on the right, a zoom lens, but because you're paying more money for it, you are paying for the feature of it being a very non-variable aperture lens, meaning, again, if you're at 24 millimeters of zoom, it's going to be, the widest you can go is 2.8. If you're at 70 millimeters of zoom, the widest that you can go is 2.8 still. And here is another just picture of those lenses from Canon. The one in the middle is a Sigma lens. It's a 35 millimeter lens. Sigma lenses are a little bit more expensive, but I can say personally that the Sigma lenses are a much higher quality than the Canon or even the Nikon lenses. So, aperture terms. There are some terms that we do need to understand while getting into aperture itself. This will be the last portion of this lecture as far as just trying to give you a good grasp for the terms that we will be using going forward as in regards to aperture. So first one being maximum aperture, which I did mention earlier. The maximum aperture is the maximum diameter of the lens opening, and it's referred to by a maximum aperture or a minimum f-stop number. As I was saying earlier, these two have a maximum aperture of 1.2 and 2.8, meaning that is the widest that those two lenses can go in regards to the aperture. The minimum f-stop number is the smallest f-stop number on the chart, the scale that I showed you earlier, and it is the lowest number that can be selected with this lens in particular. Now, let me differentiate. With your camera specifically, you're able to go very wide, you're able to go very small with your aperture as far as controlling that, but your lens determines that. So depending on what lens is attached, you're going to see a different readout. The maximum aperture varies from lens to lens and is included in the lens model name, as you can see here. So that is maximum aperture. Variable aperture lenses, as I said earlier, are typically going to be on zoom lenses. With a zoom lens, you're going to have a maximum and a minimum as far as its focal length, 18 to 55, 70 to 200 millimeter. Those are the two extremes as far as how far out you can zoom and how close you can zoom into a subject. With that, you're also going to have a variable aperture, meaning 3.5 to 5.6, 2.8 to 4.5, whatever it is, those are your extremes. So if you're at 70 millimeters as far as your zoom, your maximum aperture at that given focal length is going to be 3.5 for this example. Let's use the example of the Canon EF 24 to 70 millimeter. Okay, just to help out your understanding. This is a variable zoom lens, the 24 to 70. It is a zoom lens. it can go from 24 to 70 millimeter. So, because it is also a prime lens in that it has one aperture that it sticks at, would we say that it is a variable aperture lens? No. And the reason for that is because with this lens, you're paying top dollar for this lens to be able to use the widest aperture possible in order to get that nice bokeh, to get that nice subject differentiation, a good contrast between your subject and your background. You're paying top dollar for that, so you should be able to use that aperture at any given focal length, and that is why this lens is so expensive. With a variable aperture lens, going back to that, you are going to not be able to go as wide as certain lenses might advertise. So if you're working with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, I apologize, I don't have a picture of that up right now, but if you can just picture a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, if that has a variable aperture of 3.5 to 5.6, what that means is when you are at 70 millimeters as far as your focal length, the widest open that your lens can go as far as your aperture is 3.5. If you are at 200 millimeters in focal length, the widest open that your aperture can go is going to be 5.6. Next, we're going to have constant aperture lenses, which is actually a more correct term. It's a better way to describe these two lenses here and the other ones that we saw earlier, in that your aperture is going to be constant for these, constantly at 1.2 or 2.8, doesn't matter what your focal length is at. Prime lens is a term to describe the focal length of the camera. Types of aperture blades, depending on what brand you're working with, you are going to have different types of either you're going to have curved blades in your in your lens specifically, or you're going to have straight ones. So let me go ahead and pull that up here. Here's an example of that where you're going to have curved ones. Here is another example, but that just depends on your brand specifically, or even just your lens. They're going to have different shapes, they're going to have different blades that they use in their lenses. And then our next term, which we will be going into, is critical aperture. So critical aperture is important. Why? Critical aperture is the sweet spot for sharpness in each lens. Each lens is going to have a certain point in its aperture, typically going to be 2 steps smaller than the maximum, and I will give an example for that, where it is the sharpest, where you're going to get the most quality images out of using that aperture for any given subject. Each individual lens and each model is different in their critical apertures, and again, 2 stops smaller than the maximum aperture. With this example, 2.8 being the maximum aperture of this lens, 2 stops down from that would mean that the critical aperture, or the sweet spot for that lens, would be around 3.5 to 5.6. If you want to be more specific, it's going to be around 4.0. Okay, and depth of field. I have mentioned depth of field a couple of times in this lecture, but depth of field is just how much of your scenery, your photo, you are going to be allowing into your image. Aperture, with aperture, a larger aperture means a narrower depth of field. Almost said narrow DOF. Your distance to subject can affect your depth of field as well. If you're closer to your subject, you're going to have a narrow depth of field. If you're further away from your subject, you're going to have a much wider depth of field. If that doesn't make sense, think of it this way. If you're up close to your subject, to a person, whatever it is, you're unable to see anything else except that subject. But if you back up, you're able to see more of the scenery. Some teachers, the way that they'll teach this is they'll have you hold a pencil or a pen in front of your nose. When you do that, you're only able to focus on the pen in front of you. But as you pull that away from you, you're able to take in more of your surroundings, and that is a good picture of that depth of field. Focal length is another thing that can affect your depth of field. These are just different descriptions of things that can affect your depth of field, but focal length will affect your depth of field as well. If you have a longer focal length, meaning you're zoomed in, you're going to have a narrow depth of field. If you're zoomed out, you're going to have a wider depth of field. Pretty simple, but basically, if you're zoomed in, narrow focus. If you're zoomed out, wider focus. You're going to take in more of the scene. Very similar to distance to subject, except that you are doing it mechanically rather than physically. And that is the end of our lecture over Aperture. If you have any further questions, of course, don't hesitate to reach out to me through email, through text, however it is that you need to reach out, as well as Canvas.